the ADM. The TOGAF ADM defines a recommended sequence for the various phases and steps involved in developing an architecture, but it cannot recommend a scope for it. This has to be determined by the organization itself, bearing in mind that the recommended sequence of development in the ADM process is an iterative one, with the scope and deliverables increasing with each iteration. Each iteration will add resources to the organization's architectural repository. The main guidelines is to focus on what creates value to the enterprise and to select a horizontal and vertical scope, as well as the time period accordingly. Whether or not this is the first time around, understand that this exercise will be repeated and that future iterations will build on what is being created in the current efforts, adding to the things that we've already created in terms of width and the depth of it. The TOGAF basically defines and recommends a sequence for various phases and steps. That's what we discussed. And as an overview, what we can mention here is that the enterprise continuum, so basically the ADM and enterprise continuum and the architecture repository are the most important aspects of this framework. The enterprise continuum provides a framework and context to support the leverage of relevant architecture assets in executing the ADM. Architectural development is a continuous cyclonic process and is executing the ADM repeatedly over time. The architecture gradually adds more and more contents to the organization's architectural repository. Although the primary focus of ADM is on the development of enterprise-specific architecture, in this wide context, the ADM can also be viewed as the process of populating the enterprise-owned architecture repository with relevant reusable building blocks taken from left or more generic side of the enterprise continuum. Second thing is the ADM and the foundation architecture. In short, the ADM is also useful to populate the foundation architecture of an enterprise itself. Business requirements of an enterprise may be used to identify the necessary definition and selection in the foundation architecture. And finally, ADM and the supporting guidelines and techniques are documented in part 3, which is called ADM guidelines and techniques, is a set of resources and guidelines and templates, checklists, and other detailed material that support the application of the TOGAF ADM. Now that we know the architectural development method is a iterative cycle, let's see what are the key points of this development cycle. The ADM is iterative. For each iteration of ADM, a fresh decision must be taken as to the breadth of the coverage of the enterprise to be defined, the level of details to be defined, the extent of the time period aimed at including the number of number and extent of any intermediate time period. The architecture assets to be leveraged, including the asset created in previous iterations to the ADM cycle within the enterprise, the asset available elsewhere in the industry, other frameworks, things, for example, in other frameworks and systems, methods, and vertical industry models, etc. These decisions should be based on the practical assessment of resources and competence available, and the value that can realistically be expected to occur to the enterprise from the chosen scope of the architectural work. As a generic method, the ADM is intended to be used by enterprise in a wide variety of different geographical and applied in different vertical sector or industry types. As such, it may be, but does not necessarily have to be, tailored to specific needs. For example, it may be used in conjunction with the set of deliverables of other frameworks, where these have to be deemed to be more appropriate for the specific organization. For example, many U.S. federal agencies have developed individual frameworks and defined the deliverables specific to their particular needs or particular department's needs. So these are the things that they could probably use. Now that we know how this framework works, let's have a look at the actual structure of the ADM, which is the enterprise development or architectural development method. The phases of the ADM cycle are future, are usually divided into steps. Every one of these circles or bubbles are a step, a major step in the development cycle. The steps within this architectural development, for example, we call them phases, such as B, C, and D, are described in this in its documentation. For example, in B, C, and D, which are business architecture, information systems architecture, and technology architecture, the phases are as follows. For example, select the reference models, viewpoints, and tools. Develop baseline architectural descriptions, develop target architectural descriptions, perform gap analysis, define candidate roadmap components, resolve impacts across the architectural landscape, conduct formal stakeholder reviews, finalize the architecture at the end, and finally create the architectural definition document. So these steps that I just explained exists within every one of these circles or bubbles, which is minor steps or minor cycles inside those, specifically in phase B, phase C, and phase D. Now let's see what happens when we try to adopt ADM. The ADM is a generic method, as we mentioned, for architectural development, which is designed to deal with most system and organizational requirements. However, it will often be necessary to modify or extend the ADM to suit specific needs. One of the tasks before applying the ADM is to review its components for applicability in our organization, and then tailor them as appropriate to the circumstances of any particular individual enterprise. These activities may well produce an enterprise-specific ADM. So you basically modifying the ADM to suit your organization. One reason for wanting to adopt the ADM, which it is important to stress, is that the order of the phases in ADM is to some extent depending on the maturity of the architectural discipline within the enterprise. So the orders are not concrete, so you can change and swap different circles or different phases in that in ADM. ADM is one of the many corporate processes that make up the corporate governing model. It is complementary to and supportive of other standard program management processes, such as those for authorization, risk management, business planning and budgeting, development planning, system development, procurement, and so on. And the ADM is being mandated for use by a prime or lead contractor in an outsourcing situation, and needs to be tailored to achieve a suitable compromise between the contractor's existing practices and the contracting enterprise's requirements. This is mostly about the vendor and the enterprise. So the vendor need to know the requirements of the enterprise and modify the ADM accordingly. The enterprise is very large and complex, comprising many separate but interlinked enterprises within an overall collaborative business framework, and the architecture method need to be adopted to recognize this. Different approaches to planning and integration may be used in such case that includes the following includes the followings: top-down planning and development, designing the whole interconnected meta enterprise as a single entity. This is an exercise that typically stretches the limits of the practicality of this situation. Development of generic or reference architecture, typically of the enterprise within the organization, but not representing any specific enterprise, which individual enterprises are then expected to adopt in order to produce an architecture instance suited to the particular enterprise concerns. Replication, developing a specific architecture for one enterprise, implementing it as a proof of concept, and then taking that as a reference architecture to be cloned in other enterprises and other situations. In a vendor or product environment, a generic architecture for a family of related products is often referred to as a product line architecture, and the it's analogous to the process. Analogous process is to the outlined in previous points. Another topic that we're going to introduce here is the architectural governance. The management of all architectural artifacts, governance and related processes should be supported by a controlled environment. Typically, this would be based on one or more repository supporting versioned object and process control and statuses is available if available. The major information areas managed by a governance repository should contain things such as reference data, which is a collateral form the organization's own repository or enterprise continuum, including external data and other frameworks such as COBIT and ITIL, used for governance and interaction during project implementation. This includes the detail of information outlined previously as well. The reference data includes the description of the governance procedure themselves. The other item is the process status. All information regarding the state of any governance process will be managed. For example, of this, one of the examples of this includes the outstanding compliance requests. The other last item is the audit information. This will record all completed governance process actions and will be used to support things such as key decision and responsible personnel for any architectural project that has been sanctioned by the governance process, and the reference for future architecture and supporting process development guidance and precedences. And finally, we want to talk about the architectural integration. At the present time, the state of the art is such that the architecture integration can be accomplished only at the lower end of the integratability spectrum. Key factors to consider are the granularity and the level of details in each artifact, and the maturity of standards for the interchange of architectural descriptions. As organizations address common themes such as service-oriented architecture, SOA, and integrated information infrastructure, and universal data models and standard data structures emerge, integration towards the high end of the spectrum is getting more and more facilitated. However, there will always be the need for effective standard governance to reduce the need for manual coordination and conflict resolution.